Thank you everyone, and welcome to this year's Joint Institution Prestige event. Welcome to our sister institutions from the Institution of Chemical Engineers, the Institution of Engineering and Technology, the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland, and of course my own institution, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. The event this evening will follow the well-known BBC Question Time format, and it's really an energy debate. Just to give you some background, the UK and the wider international community is facing an energy crisis with competing demands from energy pricing, energy security, greenhouse gas emission reduction, many of which we'll be discussing this evening. The Institution of Mechanical Engineers has been working hard in the last few years, publishing many reports on many of the issues that we face in terms of our energy, emissions, and food, waste, etc. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to a report that was published just last week on energy storage. That's the top left-hand report here. If you haven't already seen it, it's an excellent report, and I recommend that you go and read that. It's free. All of these reports are free for download from the IMechE website, and we'll be sure to send you the links following this event, so please go and look at those. Questions for the debate this evening were submitted from the audience, and we have chosen 6 questions based on those that were the most popular, and to try and get a broad debate on wide energy issues, not just focused on electricity. There will be an opportunity for participation from the audience, and Ian, our chair, will direct you. So if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. There will be microphones on either side. I would just ask that you keep any comments or supplementary questions short, because we will be very short on time this evening. In addition to participation this evening, we'd invite you to participate through our Twitter feed. So those of you who may not get a chance to put your point across, you can do so on our Twitter feed. Those are the details. We are at IMechE Glasgow, and you can use the hashtag #GlasgowEnergyQT. So you can go and see what other people from the audience were saying also. You may also see some extra discussion once the video is posted online. So please do go and make comment there if there's anything you've got to say. So I will just introduce our panel. We have an excellent panel, in fact, from a broad spectrum of energy generation in the UK. I'll start with Professor Ian Arbin, who is a senior partner at Engineered Solutions. He's sitting in the centre of our panel, and he'll be chairing this evening's debate. So I'll just read some background, just to give you a little bit of context of each of our speakers. So Ian is a chartered mechanical engineer, a registered European engineer, and a chartered environmentalist with an MSc in renewable energy and environment and an MBA. Formerly MD of several engineering sector companies supplying renewable energy and energy from waste equipment for 40 years. He now runs Engineered Solutions, a sustainable engineering consultancy. Ian is a fellow of the IMechE, having chaired its Energy, Environment and Sustainability Group and its Renewable Power Committee. He is now spearheading the institution's work in energy storage, and in fact he was the lead author on the report that was published last week. He's also a fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the Energy Institute, the Institute of Refrigeration, and the Institute of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland. To his immediate left is Dr. Hannah Chalmers. Hannah has worked on CCS since 2003. She's internationally recognised for her research outputs in flexible operation of power plants with CO2 capture, and is also the UK CCS Research Centre Network Director. Her current research interests include integration of flexible CCS in electricity energy systems and combustion of biomass in air and oxyfuel atmospheres. Additionally, she's been active in the European Energy Research Alliance CCS Joint Programme since its inception, and has been elected to the Joint Programme Management Board for 2014, with specific responsibility for developing the recently established CO2 transport sub-programme. On the extreme right of the panel, we have, not politically, just physically, we have Dr. Stephen Wyatt, Strategy Director at the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, Stephen joined Catapult in December 2013 and is responsible for shaping the future direction of the Catapult and creating activity to accelerate the move to a vibrant offshore renewable energy sector through technology innovation and shared knowledge. Stephen brings considerable experience in the low-carbon arena, most notably in his previous role as Director of Innovation at the Carbon Trust, where he was responsible for managing a portfolio of innovation activity in offshore renewables, biomass heat, industrial energy efficiency, and managed issues relating to both government and industry. To his left, we have Bill Doig of Grove Consulting, Power and Energy. Bill joined Doosan Babcock, previously Mitsui Babcock, in 2004, having spent over 40 years in the electricity supply industry. Bill's career has covered a large number of roles, mainly in power stations, both coal and nuclear. And as notably, he was acting station manager of Cockenzie Power Station, which is coal-fired, director of Torness Power Station, which is nuclear, and British Energy Generation Director with responsibilities for major fleet projects. Bill was Executive Vice President of NNC in Canada, working with Ontario Power at their Pickering Power Station, which was also nuclear. Bill covered both strategic support of the EDF operational fleet and the new challenges of the nuclear new build programme. Our final panellist in this evening, on the left of the panel, is Professor David Infield, who is Professor of Renewable Energy Technologies and Manager of the Centre for Doctoral Training in Wind Energy at the University of Strathclyde. He has worked in the renewables sector since completing a theoretical physics PhD in 1978. During this time, his research interests have ranged over solar thermal system design, wind energy systems, and photovoltaics. He first worked in the Building Services Research and Information Association, then Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, where he became manager of the university's wind test site from 1988 to 1993, then moving to the University of Loughborough, where he established CREST, the Centre for Renewable Energy System Technology, and finally moving to Strathclyde in 2007. A common theme unifying his research interests has been the integration of renewable energy sources into electricity supply systems, and he has published widely on these subjects. He is Editor-in-Chief of the IET Journal on Renewable Power Generation. He leads a number of important research consortia at national and European level, and he represents the UK on international standards committees and IEA activities. He was a contributing lead author on the recent IPCC report on the climate change mitigation potential of renewables. His current research is focused on wind turbine technology, and in particular, condition monitoring of offshore wind and the integration of high penetrations of wind power into the power systems. He is interested in how demand-side management, and in particular responsive demand, including electric vehicles, can help facilitate the integration of renewables. So a massively well-qualified panel for this evening's debate. That's enough from me, and I'll hand over to Ian Arbin to now start the debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean, for that comprehensive introduction. I don't think I need to say a lot more. Suffice for me to say again to welcome you here this evening, and we're looking forward to a good debate, and hopefully one that lifts this whole debate from the levels that many degenerate into, which is my favourite form of power generation. We want to sort of move beyond that, not that that's not important, and look at the whole energy scene. I think the questions we have tonight really cover a broad spectrum of energy, not just the narrow one that so many debates unfortunately do. So without further delay, I'll call upon our first questioner, who is Kevin Duffy from AME. Just behind you.
In view of recent IPCC reports, does this panel believe the UK government is doing enough to encourage the energy sector to go green? And what role should our institutions take in tackling these challenges? Are we doing enough?
Thank you. Are we doing enough to go green? I think perhaps I'll take that one first to David
That's very kind.
to put you on the spot. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think one of the points that I hope came across in the press releases from the IPCC is that despite all the activities that have been taking place around the world, and there certainly have been a lot, and the investments in renewables, taken together though, when you look at global CO2 emissions, they are accelerating. So in that sense, if we're talking about governments worldwide, then the answer is clearly no, not enough is being done. And I think most people now accept that the 2-degree target, which itself has some, issues surrounding it, is not going to be met probably. So that's my view on the take as a whole. When we come to certain countries, different countries are doing more and less. In the UK, I think until recently, it looked as though we were really quite determined to reduce CO2 emissions. A number of factors in recent months seem to suggest otherwise. So we're now burning a lot of coal because it's cheaper to do that than use gas, and the gas CCGTs are being mothballed. And also now it's more than rumours, I think. We're expecting that onshore wind is going to have a very tough time. And that has been making a valuable contribution to low carbon generation. That, whatever your views on wind energy are, it has been doing that. So I think what looked like a strong position in the UK is rapidly weakening, and that does worry me.
Bill, you're a chartered environmentalist. Tell us about what we need to do to go green.
Well, I'd certainly agree with the comments that have been made. The big problem in my mind is that we want to have good environmental control, but we live in a society where affordability and availability of power, availability of energy for heating houses is very important to the person. And it's sometimes, that's where the argument, the theoretical, nice to have, actually degenerates into the reality of, fine, let somebody else do it. And the point that you made about countries in the world, I think that's the frustration that most of us have, that if everyone was trying to do the same thing, then it would be quite a strong position. I do agree that the environmental position has to be managed, encouraged, supported, and all the rest of it. But it's we're in this situation where you're dealing with private companies now. I'll put my cards on the table. I was very upset when they privatised the electricity supply industry, okay? Because at a stroke, the government lost control of the power industry, other than by persuasion, supplements in terms of energy support, whatever. But you are in a position where you're dealing with a business, and all but one of the major suppliers are foreign companies. So they're not that controlled, let's say, by the UK government. So I think we have a desirable situation. We have to encourage it. There's no question about the statistics, but how do you make something happen when it's all done by hands-off encouragement and legislation and taxing and other less sort of tangible methods? So I do struggle with whether we have a mechanism that's going to be real and robust enough to actually make it happen in a sensible timescale. So apologies for the sort of downbeat, but I do see lots of problems in trying to make it happen when you're trying to encourage from, like the old sort of herding cats scenario,
Indeed.
Thank you, Bill. Hannah, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so when I kind of heard this question, the first thing I thought, or reminded me of, is that I'm really glad I'm not a policymaker. So I can just commentate, and but basically it's a difficult balance at the moment. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on within the UK, and there's also a lot going on globally. And I mean, I think for me, it's difficult to do more in the current global context. So in a way, a lot of what needs to be done is to sort out the global problem so that we can then do more locally. And then you have this tug and pull effect that you need to think about. One thing I wanted to pick up a little bit on was your question about our institutions and whether we're doing enough in our institutions. And for me, the learned societies are important because we can balance reasonable neutrality, we're not totally neutral, but reasonable neutrality with a huge amount of experience and a huge amount of relevant experience as well, actually. So, I mean, as partly we have a responsibility to keep ourselves up to date and informed as professionals, whether we be younger professionals or more experienced professionals. And, I mean, one thing that certainly the Institution of Mechanical Engineers has been doing quite a lot of, you know, as time goes on, and I think some of the others as well, is to really focus on trying to get the policymakers and the regulators to understand the technical issues and how they then work into the policy, because we are in a situation where, let's face it, a lot of the people making policy do not have technical backgrounds, they haven't done engineering or even science degrees. So I think that role for the institutions is very important in our current world. And I think we're making some progress there. We could always do more. And perhaps one thing, and it's a good thing to have a lot of institutions here tonight, is coordination between the institutions where we can. So, you know, the more people that can actually agree together on what needs to be done and can communicate that in an effective way, I'm told the more of an impact that tends to have with the people that are trying to make a decision about what to do. So for me, maybe the big thing to do next is for the institutions to work on developing the cross-institution links in this area, because it's a big enough and important enough area that it's worthwhile debating it and trying to get it sorted out among us, and then use that combined strength to try to have a bigger influence perhaps on some of the key decision makers.
Thanks, Hannah. And finally to Stephen.
Sure. So I guess the UK government is motivated by security of supply, keeping the lights on, UK benefit angle around creating energy, reducing carbon and affordability. And I guess in the last few years we've had this situation where kind of the green agenda has almost been toxic politically. We've seen that dumbed right down for affordability to take the front row seat. And that's front of mind right now for the government, I guess. And so that brings us to economics and the economics around the whole green energy agenda. And we realise that renewables are propped up on subsidy. But actually the government aren't doing a bad job there, in my view. I think the RO renewable obligation was set reasonably well. The feed-in tariffs aren't badly set, actually, you know, the reasonable levels. But I think what we have constantly is sort of uncertainty. And so whilst the economics for a particular period of time may stack up broadly for offshore wind or onshore wind or whatever the technology may be, we have this lack of a clear line of sight to give the right confidence for public sector investment to come in and private sector investment, to come in. And I think that's where the government could be doing a little bit more. So not necessarily on the chunking it up, because I think that's reasonably good. It's just setting a clear line of sight, being much clearer around what it wants to do. And I think that's where we could be doing a little bit more. And I guess sort of coming back to the front end of the question about the IPCC, I think internationally we have a massive challenge. China and India in particular, these countries don't want to build their economies on expensive power, and they have a view of why should they. And so I think the UK has a real opportunity / almost obligation to make sure that whatever we're doing to develop clean technologies should be exported. And there are opportunities there to do that, and we should be all over that as an opportunity to make sure the emerging economies are growing in the appropriate way, back to that sort of macroscopic view around what are we doing globally about emissions.
Thanks. Well, you've heard the panel's view. Any comment from the audience at this point? See anybody's hand up?
Deathly silence.
Okay, well, we can allow the questioner a second bite.
Somebody on the
somebody over there. Okay.
What I was going to say was, obviously you're all members of one of these institutions, or many of them. Likewise myself, I'm a member of the IAT, and every month I get the magazine and it tells me how we're expanding into these different countries, and we've got a growing presence in the likes of China and places like that. And each of you talked about the need for us to look at is it a bigger picture and work as, you know, a world together, as a planet together. Don't we have an ethical obligation within our society, within our institutions, to be that guiding force? You know, governments naturally won't work together, whereas surely we should be the ones leading that way forward, providing that stability, and giving and setting an example.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. And just to comment on that from, I can really only speak from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers' perspective, but we have really set out our stall over the past 10 years anyway to become part of that knowledgeable input to government, both at Westminster and Holyrood. And I think, particularly with our reports, as Dean showed you earlier, we're certainly having an influence on government, very considerably more than we were 10 years ago. And I think Hannah said it's a long haul. It's very tough because one of the big problems is that politicians don't know that they need us. And that's we usually rain on their parade, and that is not a great negotiating position. So I think your point is absolutely right, but certainly on behalf of IMechE, I say we see that very much as our role, and I'd be surprised if the other institutions were too different. You know.
But I mean, I suppose an element in there which is perhaps not at the forefront of many of the activities of the institutions is the fact that although we're originally based in the UK, we do have more of a global reach now than perhaps we used to have, partly because people move around the world all the time, and partly because of chapters opening up in different places. And to be honest, I don't have the answer to your question, but I think it's a really important point that, you know, what can we do to try to help people in lots of different places have a bit of a kind of better grounded perspective on this. And I think it's something that, you know, perhaps, I don't know exactly how these things report back into other places, but that idea of the international presence, I think, is an important one for us to take with us.
It is, but I think one thing that's been lacking, I've been quite active with the IT in China, and you could say, well, the professional institutions are mainly looking just to grow their membership, you know, it's self-interest. What they don't seem to be doing overseas is coming together. So there is definitely a process going on within the UK. So IT is starting to talk to IMechE and other institutions about developing a common viewpoint. And I think, in a way, that's increasingly important. As we heard, there is more influence on government, but that's actually also a reflection of the fact that, regrettably, the civil service has sort of been de-skilled in areas of science and technology massively over my career, and that worried me. But it is an opportunity, therefore, for professional institutions to step in and give guidance where there is none internally.
I think in view of time, we'll just take one more question on this. And,
Hi, I'm Louis Villa. I'm also at the Strathclyde University. And my question goes a little bit in the same sense, I think. Isn't green, you're saying that green agenda is a little bit toxic politically. Isn't it toxic politically because we are inevitably going to move from a system where energy was cheap, where goods were cheap, easily manufacturable, to a system where goods are going to be more expensive, life is going to be less comfortable, and energy is going to be more expensive, which means that people who today go home in the winter and have a 20-degree house, they're going to go home to winter to have a 15-degree house. Colder, more expensive. Is that the kind of thing that people don't want to hear? That in the end, mankind has to do the sacrifice and slow down progress for the sake of survival?
Well, thanks for that, and it would be wonderful to debate that if we had the time. But it is a massive issue, and I'm not in any sense belittling what you said, but I think it's been very interesting to look at the IPCC's new fifth assessment and see how they are more moving in that direction. IPCC has changed its ground considerably over the 5 assessments. And I think we do have to look at much more at adaptation now and not simply at mitigation, because these things pretty much are certain to happen. So if you don't mind, we'll park it there, but thank you very much for the input. Our second question is from Dr. John Bingham of the Energy Technology Centre. John.
My question is about energy demand. Should policymakers do more to promote municipal, industrial, and domestic energy efficiency?
Thanks, John. Stephen, sorry to come back to you first, but I think that's your kind of area. So,
Yep, it certainly once was. Yeah, so a very quick answer. Yeah, absolutely. You know, energy efficiency is still by far the lowest hanging fruit that we can have. You know, we've had energy efficiency programs probably for the last 15 years or so, but there's still so many quick wins to be had, and we absolutely should take that economic lens to energy efficiency in the same way we do renewables. You know, and it's absolutely right that things like you know, when you apply for a grant or subsidy under the renewable heat incentive, first you have, you know, they check that you've done everything appropriate to insulate your property. Yeah, absolutely right. We should be doing that. One of my frustrations actually is when I, in that long-winded biog you heard, I spent 8 years at CT. The first job I did was looking at the business case for smart meters. And we did a policy piece that said, well, okay, you need to start rolling out in 2010, take a decade to do it, and you will roll out smart meters to the 2.2 million SMEs in the UK, and you'll get 5% energy savings year on year. Great. No-brainer. The business case was made in 2 years or so. And we're still debating the small print around the rollout of smart meters, for example. And there are things that you can do, these enablers for energy efficiency as well. So do the obvious stuff, you know, the installation, the double glazing, whatever, and then just get on the smart meter argument, start being more intelligent about what you do, get into the process control, then start thinking about upgrading your capital kit, and that sort of thing. So yeah, in summary, there's absolutely loads of mileage in this space.
let's just come along the table, Bill.
Okay. No, I fully agree with that. It's very much the low-hanging fruit. The trouble is, the question is absolute. You know, what can we do cheaply, readily, easily? What can we as individuals do? And that is to make sure your house is properly insulated and all the wasteful aspects are dealt with. But again, it's sometimes the communication of that is very sort of sterile and really goes over the head of many people. So I think I would agree that it has to be done, and we really need to do it in a more positive and high impact manner, because yes, it's the easy thing to actually do and make some impact. But I think we tend to be doing it in a fairly sort of sterile way, as I say, and it's not having the impact on the wider population as it should. Very sort of narrow take-up.
So, just a couple of comments, if I may, Hannah, before we move to you. About 10 years ago, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers developed something called the energy hierarchy, where the first tier is energy conservation and the second tier is energy efficiency. And we plugged this to government. It's taken a decade to get that message across, and it still isn't across fully. So we're certainly aware of it. I think government isn't so much, and I think that's rather exemplified by what happened at the end of last year, where the Green Deal was delayed. The very measure that was put in place to improve energy efficiency, energy conservation at at a domestic level was delayed in favour of reducing energy costs. Your point Stephen made earlier about affordability. So there is, it's not that there weren't, I mean, we might have views on the Green Deal, but it wasn't that there wasn't anything in place, but there was, and it's been delayed. So, sorry Hannah, I thought it was just worth interposing about.
Absolutely. So, I mean, basically, I'm sure that we're all going to say yes when we get all the way down the end. So the question is about the detail here. The devil is in the detail, and there's a huge amount of detail in this area which is not well understood. And frankly, with my background, I'm probably as misinformed as anybody on this issue. But for me, a big question and an important part of your question was that you asked about different kinds of energy efficiency in different spaces, so the municipal and the industry as well as the domestic side. And I don't know enough about the sector to say that we should really focus on one part or another, but I think perhaps one way to see things move forward a bit more effectively might be to perhaps think about, really the priorities of the different energy efficiency things that we can do, and making sure that the things that are supported are the ones that are with the individuals or companies or regions that are most likely to take them up in an appropriate way and that kind of thing. But that's basically as a half-informed observer rather than a deep specialist in the area, so hopefully you can do better than me on that.
I'm not sure. Obviously, I'm going to say yes. I mean, my day-to-day enthusiasm might be for generating electricity, but I think absolutely I've always accepted that virtually always it's cheaper to save energy than generate energy anew. What's always worried me is that it's always come so low down the priority list, despite the fact that those who think about it will put it at the top of the list. And this may be not totally representative of the truth, and if I've slandered him, he'll come back and do me, I'm sure. But one of my colleagues was in a meeting with Alistair Darling when he was charged of the Exchequer, and it basically came down to this. He said, well, I could either make two decisions, 2 nuclear power stations, or I could try and persuade, tens of millions of people to make decisions. So, as a politician, what do you think I'm going to do? Obviously, I'm going to build the 2 nuclear power stations. And there is something about that. Governments just don't engage. They see complexity. They see the complexity of different people reacting. And if they don't get the subsidies right, maybe some people make money rather than insulate their homes. And it all just gets murky. And the result is that we don't deliver. Other countries have clearly found better ways, and perhaps we can learn from them, but there's no simple answer, or I'm sure we would have found it. But it's so important that I hope that there are people out there seeking the ways forward at these different levels of investment.
Thanks.
Can I just make one
ahead.
point? The thing that really gets me very frustrated is the fact that the movers and shakers tend to be the politicians. And as I keep sort of, apologies to politicians, but their period of real honest tenure is about 2 years. They're working up to understand the job, 2 years of operation, and then they're thinking about how to get re-elected. We in the industry, we're talking about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So it's to try and get a synchronization of that, where it's not something which the businessman, excuse me, is always worried that the policy of today might only last a few years. So it's to try and get some confidence in long-term reliability, security of business case, and that, unfortunately, most businesses realise that it's a very transient thing, so that the take-up can be a wee bit less enthusiastic than it should be.
Yeah, well, thanks for that point, Bill, because energy efficiency has to be long-term, and that doesn't fit with the political agenda, so fair point. Comments from the audience on this one? The gentleman there.
Touching on both energy efficiency and the points that were made earlier about affordability, the key with energy efficiency is it's just not sexy. And it's not sexy because it's not economic. And the only language that politicians really understand is the economy. you know, to coin a phrase, it's the economy stupid. You know, to my mind, the problem with energy efficiency is it doesn't give the same wider economic benefit as investment in generation technology, clean generation technology, new different types of generation technology. We all saw the splash around Hinkley 3 and the investment that was going to go into the local economy down there. We see the splash on an almost monthly basis of, you know, big industrial companies looking to base their renewable operations out of the UK. Now, these are all great things, but surely if we want the government to take us seriously on energy efficiency, we need to speak their language. We need to tell them how that's going to benefit UK industry, where the opportunities are for British companies to make technologies that are going to facilitate that efficiency.
That's a fair point, yeah.
I think at the end.
Yeah, and I understand your point. I'm not sure. Well, I hope that the politicians aren't quite that stupid. But you know, I suppose I'm inclined to side with you, but I hope they're not. In the sense that, you know, clearly, if you can knock 10% off the energy bills of businesses in the UK, that economically, that's got to be a good thing. Stopping businesses going you're stopping companies going out of business. You're improving their competitive on the global stage. You know, there are economic benefits fundamentally hardwired into being more energy efficient. So yeah, I think you're right. It needs to be unpacked properly. I'm sure there are plenty of think tanks, universities, etc., who can help us get our heads around this argument. But yeah, it absolutely needs to be publicised. And your point about energy efficiency not being sexy, yeah, absolutely right. That's been a problem that people have been banging their head against for years, and so perhaps we need to think about that as well.
Yeah. There was a gentleman here, Dean, had, oh, sorry, Andrew.
Cliff Lyons, member of the former Institute of Electrical Engineers. There's another approach to energy efficiency, and these are the passive houses that have been built in Oldham in Lancashire. The estimated cost for running these houses is, for heating them, is in the region of £20 per year. An article in The Guardian in November 2013 did an analysis of these, and this is using a heat exchanger in the loft, in which the heat which is generated within the house from bodies, cooking, etc., goes through a passive heat exchanger and heats the incoming air. Now, several of these houses have been built, and I'm going to make it a personal challenge to go down and have a look at them. But this is a German approach to this. The houses are designed so they're super efficient as far as ventilation is concerned and drafts. They've got triple glazing in them, and also they've gone to the trouble of ensuring that major windows are south-facing. I just wonder what the panel's view is of that approach, because it is here right now. The estimate is it will add about £20,000 to the cost of a house in the region of £200,000.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, it's one of those things I'd love to talk about because it happens to be one of my specialist subjects. But I know Strathclyde does quite a bit in the passive house area, doesn't it? And there is a lot of, I mean, as you say, it makes a lot of sense.
Can I just make a quick comment on that? My first ever job was in building services. All the technology you mentioned was available back then. Mm-hmm. And what I suppose I found a bit disturbing, that it's taken for me to get grey hairs for this technology to start coming to the UK. Mm-hmm. I don't know why we have been so slow to take up standard approaches that have been well known in Germany and Scandinavia for now decades. Yeah.
I'm going to have to cut the conversation there because we're well behind our schedule here. But thank you all for those comments. Our third question is from Ben Reid of Edinburgh University.
Ben's not here, so I'll read this question.
Okay, go ahead.
So Ben has asked, what can be done to solve the base load and dispatchability problems associated with renewable energy and nuclear power?
Okay, somebody described this to me the other day as where the inflexible meets the intermittent, which I thought was a rather apt way of describing it. Countless words have been said on this subject, so While I'm not in any sense saying it isn't an important subject, can we keep our comments reasonably brief on this? And I'll go to Bill first, because you must be an expert in base load. Right?
Well, yes. I mean, in simple terms, my answer to that is you must have quite a comprehensive base for power production. All of the components are necessary. Base load, intermittency, pump storage, whatever. But it has to be a managed totality. And I spent some of my early career in the Grid Control Centre at Kirkintilloch, and you wouldn't believe how nervous these guys were, where you're waiting on when's the commercial break from Coronation Street coming up, is it? And they're counting down the seconds, and then suddenly the kettles are going, the toilets are being flushed, and I mean it's very difficult. Now you add the complexity of the wind's blowing, the wind's not blowing, the sun's out, the sun's not out, and you have to try and manage it. So there has to be a very well thought out amalgam of all the technologies. That's all I have to say. But some of them have benefits in one way and vulnerabilities in others. So it's the management of the whole suite of generation, I think, is the only way to handle it. And there's no easy answer. There is no easy answer.
No, indeed. It occurs to me that what we're doing at the moment to balance these two is use fossil fuels, and Hannah, you're very much involved on how fossil fuels might continue to be usable.
Yep, absolutely. And basically I've spent a substantial proportion of my professional career looking at how to keep them usable from a carbon perspective and also from a flexibility perspective, in between nuclear and aspects of the renewables technologies that are perhaps not so controllable as others. So basically there's a bunch of options out there that you can kind of think of as being infill generation. So they're going to be stuck in the sandwich between nuclear and intermittent renewables. Fossil fuel combined with CCS and biomass combined with CCS. If you've got the right technology choices, is one way that you could do it. There's a bunch of others as well, but I've been asked to be brief, so I'm not going to go there. The main thing is that none of this is going to happen if you don't have a market or a payment regime that actually lets those infill generators make a business case. And at the moment, there's a lot said about these technologies being able to fill the gap technically, but we don't have the answer for the business case for those people yet.
Okay, I'll be brief. At the moment, we don't have a problem. The penetration of renewables and nuclear in our system is such that it is absorbed within the standard power system controls that have been developed over the last century or so. Where I think the problem will come is if we continue, which some of us would quite like to see, increasing decarbonisation of electricity from different means, renewables being one of them. For me, the long term means we have to look at demand-side management, where instead of taking the load as given and then all the power plant has to adjust itself second by second to meet that load, that we actually take advantage of the flexibility in many loads like water heating and perhaps future loads like space heating or electric vehicle charging, and use that inherent flexibility to retime our demands to take advantage of when the wind is blowing, for example. Now that's not going to be easy to achieve, but a lot of people are looking at how to refine the mechanisms. But as Hannah said, if the actual time variable costs are not passed on in some way, then this isn't going to happen.
Steve.
Yeah, just to echo that, absolutely. We can use the country as a giant energy storage machine here. Electrification and transport, plug-in hybrids, using your electric vehicles as batteries to smooth out the base load. Time of use tariffs use economics to try and smooth out the base load. I think there's a lot we can do. We can be a lot smarter about smoothing out those peaks and troughs. And I suppose the other point I'd make is when we're building offshore wind farms, onshore wind farms, PV, I suppose people are giving quite a bit of thought to where we locate these things. So we're not necessarily putting them in places where they are unpredictable. We do understand the wind resource regime. Moving from onshore to offshore has allowed us to get capacity factors higher up, more reliability, in terms of, or more predictability in terms of what we can generate. So we're kind of moving renewables in the right direction as well. But I think the whole demand-side management agenda is where the answer lies on this one.
Thank you. I think given that there are whole conferences on this subject, we'll probably move on to the next question because we are running out of time, which is from Dr. Alistair IMechE of University of Glasgow.
So, at least in public, the energy debate seems to have largely focused on electricity generation, but with estimates of over 50% of total energy demand in Scotland coming from heat and around 30% from transport, are there sustainable solutions that can meet all of these demands?
Right, I'll probably go back to David on this one, I think.
It's a tough one. Fuels for transport. There are biofuels, but they're contentious. You know, should you displace growing food with growing energy crops? EU targets seem sensible to displace certain percentages of fuel at certain times with biofuels. To do that 100%, I think, will be extremely difficult. Certainly in Europe, where it's just too crowded, too many cars. So maybe some sort of social change is needed. Some things perhaps in the long term can't continue. You know, we always say to ourselves, you know, oh, I can't imagine how we could live without the car. But, you know, for centuries people did, you know. But these things are not easy. One of the things that we're anticipating, because renewable generation of electricity has developed very well over recent decades and is becoming more and more cost effective, is actually using that electricity to try and provide those services, whether they be electric trains or electric cars, and heat, perhaps even electricity for heat, perhaps using heat pumps to make it more efficient. But it's a valid question, and I don't think the answers are all just sitting there. It will require huge investment to deliver this.
Thank you, David. Bill, we all know that nuclear power stations in particular generate vast quantities of heat, which we manage to waste. When are we going to recover that heat?
Yeah, well, I know I was involved with RNS when we were doing some of the initial design work prior to construction, and there was some fairly ambitious plans then to use the waste heat for market, great sort of acreages of glasshouse and whatever. Fine, we were up for that, but once they did the sums, the heat transient and the sort of thermal gradients were such that if once you went beyond a few miles, there was no heat left. Otherwise, you would have had all sorts of tomato growth and a whole different industry in East Lothian. The only place I've seen it work is where it's and it's not an aspect which is left to the choice of the individual. Was out in Russia where I spent quite a number of visits, where whole towns are heated from the nuclear stations because the town exists because the station's there, and they actually do the mechanics of the process and take the heat to the homes. But when you're in a country like ours, where you've all this complexity which is pre-existing, then we did the sums and it didn't work out. There was no economic sort of value in it. And I think the question, I've made this comment generally about most of these questions, it does always come down, I mean, whatever we think, it always comes down to there being a business case somewhere. And at the end of the day, if you suppress the electrical load, take that profit away from the generating company, then you have to make it up in another way. And you're talking about subsidies, you're talking about political mandates, I don't know, but there is a problem in terms of the sheer mechanics of using the heat. You know, you're right, the heat comes out, apart from having slightly larger fish in the outfall from the station, they seem to enjoy the extra heat. But there's no sort of managed policy that I could think about.
I think you've hit on the crucial point. This happens to be another field I've worked in all my career, and it comes down to who pays for the heat distribution. And as you rightly say, it's completely unreasonable to expect the utility to pay for it. That's not what it was set up to do. But government doesn't want to pay for it either. Where it works excellently is in Denmark, where almost all of their district heating comes from standard thermal power stations or from energy from waste plants. And they've perfected the art of transporting it for 100 kilometres with a 2 degrees sea temperature loss. So it can be done, but somebody has to pay for it. And Stephen, I wonder if you'd like to pick up on that.
Yeah, I suppose I was kind of, while you were saying that, I was mulling over, I recall travelling across Iceland, and they have something like a 90-kilometre pipe to pump heat from a thermal spring, I guess, into Reykjavik. And of course they can do that because the heat is free, effectively. They, but they still justify putting in the capital infrastructure, this 90-kilometre pipe. So yeah, absolutely, it can be done. I suppose for me, it comes back to one of the earlier questions around energy efficiency again. Let's be smarter about what we're doing with our heat before we start worrying about how we're going to get more of the stuff. So I think that's important. If we do that, then clearly the question was geared around Scotland. So clearly biomass is a big play here. And we're just beginning to figure out, as an industry, how to effectively install and operate biomass kit. Again, the Austrians have been doing it for years. We've now figured out how to configure these systems, having had years of plumbers diversifying into installing biomass kit. We're now getting the proper engineering expertise that's doing that. So I think there's a lot of mileage there. Ground source heat pumps for sure. And back to the point we made earlier about more electrification. I think if we're doing that, if we're smartly using our heat, then there's no reason why that can't work as well. So yeah, that's probably me on that one.
Thanks. And Hannah?
I'm not sure there's really that much to add to what's already been said. One thing that does come up when you hear all these things, and again, coming back to the demand agenda, is the question from our colleague in the audience right back at the beginning. If we want to make big changes in these sectors, and let's face it, we probably do if we're worried about the low carbon agenda, then what are people going to buy and what are people going to live with? And it's interesting, what that will mean for which solutions are actually, saleable and ultimately used.
Thank you. I would add to that I encourage you to read our new energy storage report. I think it's the first time that any major report on the subject has seriously looked at the storage of heat energy. And I think we've achieved a bit of a first in that, so I'd commend it to you. Comments from the audience on this point? Gentleman here.
I was just on this point, I think. I've just seen an example quite recently. I was chatting to a guy who, up in Aberdeen, who set up a big server farm. Obviously, a massive increased amount of computing power using these days. Most of these places need huge amounts of cooling for the CPUs. This guy, he had 6 megawatts of heat that was being generated through this server farm, and it was a quarter of a mile away from a swimming pool that Aberdeen Council were putting in. And he said to them, "You can have my heat for free." And they said, they went through the whole process and basically found that the way that the funding was structured for the swimming pool meant that no one would pay for the quarter mile of pipe and that kind of thing. And it's just this lack of sort of joined up thinking, I think, that I'm sure you guys get frustrated about. And it's perhaps it comes back to this sort of policy making and informing the government and councillors that this is just a complete waste of all this heat going away. So you put a separate boiler in for the swimming pool.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's just many examples of perhaps things like that, are there?
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I mean, basically, this is a huge energy systems problem, and we're not very good at energy systems problems for the kind of reasons that we've already kind of heard about. And if we're going to fix low carbon energy, then it would be helpful if we could work out what on earth we do about these kind of problems, because, you know, we do need joined up thinking, and people talk about industrial ecology and all that kind of stuff, and, you know, that kind of thing is going to be important if we're going to do this in a way that society can bear.
Yeah, and I just to illustrate the point, I forget exactly when it was built, but the large energy from waste plant called CellChip in Lewisham in southeast London. The CellChip's name stood for South East London Combined Heat and Power, and I have personally seen the flange where the heat bit would have been transported to Lewisham if anybody had ever built the pipe, but they didn't. Anybody else on this before we leave it? Yeah.
Hi, again, sorry, I like talking in public. My question is about price. Do you think that in the UK, the electricity price is very cheap if you compare to other countries in Europe, like Denmark, like Germany, where they've shut down nuclear power and they let the price rise? Is it a problem of price? Should we let electricity or energy price get tenfold higher, more expensive, so then it's gonna be worth building the pipes because there is money to be made in there?
I suspect you're right, and again, thank you for that contribution. And I'd love to spend a conference on the subject, but I think we won't go there tonight. I think we're probably going to have to move on because of time. Our next question is from Jonathan Strachan with FMC Technologies.
So, putting your political views aside, would Scotland be better equipped for a secure energy future as an independent nation or as part of the UK? And what evidence is there that supports this?
Well, thank you for that. Certainly a topical question. You're like me, you're so sick and fed up with the debate at the moment that you're probably not interested in the question. But it is important. And who wants to take a stab at that? Okay.
Again, going back to my sort of personal involvement with it, I do find a certain amount of humour in the way Alex Salmon presents some of his arguments, because, as I know, because of what I said earlier about trying to manage the sort of demand for electricity power, you have to have a bigger system with multiple inputs and all the rest of it. And to talk about having the capacity, you have to try and look through the argument. And the argument of what's the annual usage is really irrelevant. It's what's the peak load demand. And it would be nice if England and Wales were prepared to be the heat sink or the supplier to keep the Scottish system in a nice, gentle, highly efficient, no sort of no problems and no sort of huge spikes. But I'm sure that's not going to happen. So I do think that bigger is better, and sadly, because of the fact that we're an island, we can't be as big as we would like to be, because continental Europe is much better placed to do the balance and all the different fuels and the different sort of climates and whatever. And unfortunately, we are what we are. I would be uncomfortable to see us trying to pretend that being smaller is going to be better. And that's not political, that's just a statement of fact as I see it. Steve?
Yep, I'd agree with all of that, but notwithstanding that, I guess And I've read this manifesto trying to get my head around exactly what would happen. I don't understand it. But essentially, I suppose a bit more autonomy would mean that we could build more, I say we, I've been here a year, but we could build a bit more onshore wind, quite a bit more onshore wind, and we've got the space, and you know, that is economic today. It's probably, you know, the cheapest, if not one of the cheapest forms of generating electricity, so why not do a bit more than that? We've got, you know, world-leading wave and tidal resource. That's a few years off, but yeah, absolutely it's there. And the offshore wind resource is great. Some of the sites are slightly trickier than down south, but it's still there. And so the potential is there to sort of release the shackles of Westminster, if you like, and put the boosters under it all. But of course, you do need the link to the UK, you know, the link of the UK to balance all of that out. I think Scotland did 46% of of electricity from renewables last year, but it only did that because it had this big balancing sink, and so we're going to need that regardless.
You also come to the question of affordability. The way the ROCs system works means that the incentives in Scotland are 90% funded by the rest of the UK. And that is an obvious factor that could change radically depending on the decision in September, because I certainly my English colleagues, and I'm a half-breed by the way, my English colleagues are certainly not interested in paying subsidies for Scots to generate electricity, you know? And so, I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just saying that is what it is, and it's another factor that has to be taken into consideration. Either of you two want to develop that any further?
I just want to make some simple comments, perhaps, and people were talking about you know, the need to be part of a larger power system, and that is so obviously true. I find it difficult to believe that any independent Scotland would actually sever the wires that link the two power systems. Most of Europe seems to be happily managing to interconnect more and more widely, so I'm sure that won't happen. If we just come to it was already mentioned, but the onshore wind resource, I mean, Scotland really has an incredible onshore wind resource. I can't remember all the exact figures, but you can look up the statistics. And if that is seen as a national resource, if an independent Scotland wants to exploit that, England in the future would have to buy that electricity to help meet its own European targets. So people might find that that's the new oil, you know, or gas, but it's actually renewable and it's a source of income for a nation in the future. So I think from that perspective, however complex the market mechanisms might be, and I don't claim to understand them, and there are all these little bits of details which are incredibly important, but if you just stand back and look at the resource, it's got to be worth something.
So I'm not aware of a particularly robust evidence base on this point at the moment. So frankly, it's unclear to me. I agree a lot with, I have a lot of resonance in my own opinion with what's already been said by other people. And for me, how secure or otherwise Scottish energy supply will be in an independent Scotland if it happens comes down to what happens with things like funding frameworks and market arrangements and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know what the plan is on that. In fact, I suspect at the moment there is not a plan. So that kind of worries me a bit. And therefore I'm a bit unclear about where we might end up.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think for obvious reasons we probably won't open up the floor on that interesting question nevertheless. Thank you. And our final question is from Eric McCrory of SEPA.
What single measure would panellists advocate to have the largest impact on greenhouse gas emissions reduction?
Well, I'll go to Hannah first on this one.
Thanks for that. So that's a really good question, and thank you for it. For me, I think the most important thing is that we listen to the climate science community and what's actually needed. And I don't know if people have come across the work of Miles Allen and his colleagues, but they talk about the trillionth ton and the fact that what we do needs to be based on cumulative carbon or cumulative kind of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And I think if we're going to get the greenhouse gas problem right, we need to somehow get that to be the basis of global climate policy. I don't know how we get there, but I think that's what we need to do. And then kind of link back to the first question about the IPCC, one of the things that came out of there in a big way this time that's perhaps not been there before is the use of quote-unquote negative emissions technologies. So how do we deal with the overshoot that we may have if we believe that cumulative carbon is what we're aiming for? So sorting out those technologies, they might not be the biggest contributors, but sorting out something that can suck some carbon out of the air, whether it be biomass combined with CCS or whether it be some of the more weird and wacky things that are out there, for me is kind of important in the current context.
I have no real answer to this one. Other than to fly the flag for a reasonable proportion of nuclear power to make sure that some of the predominant base load is done with a low carbon generation technology. There's so many other things, which comes back to one of my earlier points, where unless there's a business driver, then the politicians can only maneuver the process to a certain extent. And we have to really try very hard to get and produce an argument that is robust, sustainable and long-term. But other than that, I seriously don't know how to answer that question any further.
Yep, from me, I guess I was described as being on the far right at the start of the evening, so I guess you could say that a systematic population reduction is the thing that you should do. But, I'm not going to. But instead, two things, I guess. Make energy efficiency sexy, as the point was made earlier. That's absolutely a no-brainer. But I think that only helps a proportion of the globe, I guess. And so I think doing everything we can do in the developed nations to make sure the emerging economies are adopting low-carbon technologies as soon as is possible, I think is probably the single thing that we can do in the sort of the longer-term post-2030 view, and that's probably the number one thing I'd go for, I guess.
Before I go to David, just picking up on your point about population growth, I think this is a point that is largely missed by politicians worldwide. You look at the figures, the projections for this century, from the beginning of this century, is that population globally will approximately double, but that energy demand will rise by a factor of 5 over the century, simply because most of the population growth will be in developing countries which have aspirations to use more and more energy. And we tend to always look at this question from the standpoint of a developed nation and not consider that gigantic impact of all those billions of people in the rest of the world, and they're meeting their aspirations. So I mean, this is crucial, because there isn't going to be enough fossil fuel to meet that demand, and it's something that has to be considered. David, would you like to?
No, my thinking was actually very much along those lines. And in fact, one of the things I noticed in the IPCC report, which I think hadn't been so clear in previous ones, is they drew attention to these two things: the population issue and the growth of population, but even more important, the growth in individual energy consumption as the world population struggles to do what America did in terms of energy per capita. Mm-hmm. Now, you wanted a single measure, and this is where it just gets so difficult, and I think it would have to be, in the end, to accommodate changes in lifestyle. How that's achieved, I don't know, because we could see that energy prices definitely will go up. In fact, there was a very interesting presentation I saw the other week. It doesn't matter what energy source you take. If you look at the costings from 10 years ago and the costings now for gas or for nuclear or for renewables, virtually all of them are rising up incredibly fast for a whole range of complex reasons, perhaps because the financiers are demanding so much money for the money they lend to projects. And we can see them getting rich, and then energy costs go up correspondingly. But perhaps they do have to go up so that people can say, well, actually none of us can afford to get in cars and burn up litres and litres of fuel in the way that we do, and have enormous consumption of goods, you know, more and more. But it's very difficult, because when human beings get used to something, to get used to less is something that it seems very hard to make that transition. It's associated with going backwards. So how we deal with that, I have no idea, but we have to talk about it and think about it, I think.
Well, thanks for that. Any, I'm sure there will be comments from the floor on this. I see a gentleman in the blue shirt at the back there.
I think the fact that population are getting used to energy consumption is interesting. However, I think when we look at China, which is, I don't know, if the largest polluter in the world, or top two, I would imagine, the Chinese population are starting to reject this because of the air quality in their cities. And I wonder what the panel thinks of that.
I'm not sure we have time to debate that. The air quality is a very important part of this debate. Okay, do you want to say something?
A quick one. I had the pleasure of going out to China and presenting to the Expert Commission on Climate Change in China. They do have one. You know, they were sceptical that the West were doing everything they were about energy efficiency, renewable energy, etc. Why would the West hamstring themselves with larger energy bills than is absolutely necessary? But they were willing to do something if they could be convinced that actually the playing field was at least broadly level. And I think one of the things we can do is to make sure that we are doing everything we can to broadcast to these developing nations that actually, yes, these technologies are available. Yes, in the longer term, they do represent economic growth opportunities, as well as sort of that shorter term thing you need to do to improve air quality or reduce your carbon emissions. So I think there's that kind of dialogue with these developing nations is absolutely so key in this whole agenda.
An interesting statistic is that, and I didn't find this out until recently, despite having been in China many times, China's renewable energy target for 2020 is the same as ours. The big difference is that they might hit theirs.
And they do care hugely that we walk the talk, not just talk the talk.
Yeah.
That's what they look at, what we're actually doing.
Other comments? There's another one at the back there. I can't quite see.
It's interesting if we're thinking of cumulative emissions and then also thinking in a global context, whether rather than funding clean technologies here in the UK, we should look to see if it's cheaper to outsource our emissions reduction and fund cleaner projects in developing countries.
Interesting point. Anybody want to pick up on that?
Well, I've certainly been involved in some committees, national committees, where the reality of what the emissions were from the UK were, let's say, were strongly challenged, because some of the statistics that were put forward were very much with the fact that China and other countries are now making the stuff that we as an industrial country of you know, the 19th century, 20th century, we were doing for ourselves. So to claim that our contribution to carbon reduction has gone down by just exporting it seems a bit disingenuous to me, but that's kind of what we're playing games with in international politics a wee bit.
Yes, well, as a manufacturer, I can only echo that because we have certainly outsourced our emissions. Anybody else from the audience? Yeah.
In terms of affecting behaviour change with people, which I think you're saying you don't know how to do that, maybe as engineers what we should do is just not worry too much about the impending lack of power we're going to have, and we should just let bad blackouts happen. That might provide the impulse of behaviour change that we need.
I think
that's got a response.
Yeah, I've often thought that is when people will realise what engineers do. Yeah.
But of course, you could get very unwanted forms of behaviour change. You know, once societies get destabilised, everything looks nice and cosy. It doesn't take very much to tip societies over the edge into chaos and violence. And so I guess that what keeps politicians a bit exercised.
It didn't happen in the 1970s, I don't think. There were blackouts then, but not 3-day weeks.
It was, well, they were planned, weren't they? Yes, 3-day weeks. I lived through that. Yeah, it wasn't as bad as people said, you know.
A serious comment on that. One of the slogans that I object to is "when the lights go out," because when the lights go out, you can light a candle. When the heat stops, you've got real issues. There's another way we are very focused on the electricity sector without looking at the whole energy scene. I'll perhaps take one more comment if there is one.
So when I was asking that question, I thought I'd better ask it myself as well, and I found it very difficult to come up with a single thing. What did occur to me though was that there's possibly more of a solution than I think we're currently making with smart meters and smart meter technology. To my mind, a lot of smart meters merely tell you how much you're spending, and they're supposed to sort of scare you into better behaviour. Whereas we have the technology to do smart meters that can put your central heating pump off, that can put your fridge onto pulse mode and things, and this can hugely reduce demand. So if you equate the added cost of putting out smart meters, how many smart meters do you get for a new gas-fired power station? You know, is it not worthwhile in Scotland to maybe do smart meters for central Scotland free, and take that off the reduction in need to have a new power station? I'm not sure what the numbers would be, but I would think they might stack up.
Yeah, I can't do the maths in the head, but they're about 126 quid each, I think, times by whatever number it is. But I think I was perhaps a little bit unkind when I talked about the length of time it's taken to sort of get the policy in order to roll out smart meters, because I know they've spent a lot of time trying to get a consistent and standardised platform for all smart meters. The theory being that you put in a vanilla flavour smart meter that has a lot of potential, but actually the customer is only incurring the basic minimum cost. But because these meters last for 25 years, you've got to make sure the platform has got the potential to take all the add-ons, all the demand side management, get it talking to your refrigerator, your washing machine, charging your car. We've got to make sure that when we do this, we're putting them in once, and we're creating the right platform to unlock all the potential you've alluded to.
Is this something that government should be saying, this is the standard we want, and making it mandatory that they would conform to that standard? Would that be a solution?
Well, that's what they're supposed to be doing. They're just taking their time, aren't they?
Exactly. You're back to my point about when the CGB and SSEB were in place, because they were government. They'd no serious business case to make. They had to produce power, to do it safely, make sure that the demand was met. And then we changed to a pure business-driven process where, as we're coming around to saying, we need some mechanism to make it either mandatory or make it very appealing. But at the moment, we're kind of between two stools here. And until we have one or the other, or a sort of complex amalgam of both, we're not going to get it, because you need the whole nation to be hooked into a system, not just if you fancy doing it, maybe not, don't worry, you know, and the whole thing just collapses, because the dynamic and the sort of the whole size of the process beats small intermittent solutions. You have to get something that's going to be managed on a global basis, whatever. Not easy to
no, well, I think on that point, although it might not be the most positive, we will call an end to the discussion. We're rather over time, but I want to thank you all for that excellent questions and the further contributions, and of course thanks to the panel for making this really, I think, quite worthwhile evening. So, thank you.
I'd just like to add my thanks to our chair, Ian, and the other panellists. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. We received a lot of questions to choose from for the evening, and I think we've covered quite a broad range of subjects. It's been extremely informative, so thank you to our panel. If we can show our appreciation in the normal way, please.